So let's summarize some of the points that we just made quickly by going through a few slides. The first thing we want to say about DevSecOps is that it's not about the technology. It can be about technology, but that's only half the story, or perhaps even less than half the story. It's as much about the human roles and the human responsibilities as it is the responsibilities of the tools that are proxies for our human intent. When I started studying the use of promise theory in management some time ago, I came upon a group on the internet that are reinventing agile infrastructure and agile change, a group called the Open Leadership Network. And they had a very nice wheel, sort of like the Buddhist eightfold way, these 8 core patterns. And I started to apply promise theory to these and actually built a course out of it, which you can find online. But I find some of these points really quite interesting and being central to the idea of cooperation. One of the key things is about invitation rather than throwing things at people as impositions. We try to invite cooperation in a more trust-building fashion, building slowly upon communications, offer something without expecting something in return, and try to build up a cadence of communication that builds trust. And things like authorization, the way we interact, sharing of knowledge, explicit agreements, the sharing of boundaries or the management of boundaries, defining boundaries, as we were talking about with regard to resources earlier. All of these topics appear in this framework as well. And it turns out that promises are quite a nice way to frame some of these issues too. So promise theory for me is a kind of a cycle. We use it in this circular way to start a process by promising the things that we want to configure and reason about. We may need to use certain approximations. Can we promise exactly what we want, or can we be certain our promise will be precisely understood? Or do we have to be a bit approximate, a bit fuzzy? And in that fuzziness, would that lead to compromising certain things that we want, like security, rapidity, or speed, or whatever? The way we interact, leading to collaboration, and then from collaboration to cooperation, which is more than just collaboration, right? We need to be also aligned in the same direction. Can we use our expression of promises being a bit clear to align ourselves clearly and in an easy way to understand? And this applies both to the technical and the social side of things, which we can treat separately, and ultimately we need to treat them together to deal with human-computer systems. So many years ago at Cisco, I drew this diagram on the board to try and explain promise theory, the difference between imposition and promise. Imposition, which tends to not be successful, is trying to impose on someone, forcing them to do something, like make it so, like Captain Picard. And I used a block like a fist coming down here, make it so. And you may be unable or unwilling to comply. So this is why impositions are not necessarily, will not necessarily lead to the outcome that you expect. You are starting with an intention from someone else, Captain Picard, and you're trying to impose it upon somebody else, Commander Data, but he may not be willing or able to comply. So it's uncertain because the source of intent is not the same as the point of action for keeping the promise. Promises are the other way around. That's advertising, look what I can do. I promise I can do this for you. And that's much more certain because the source of the intent is the same as the source of the action. So it's complete information all in one place. Impositions tend to lead to conflicts. I think you made this point earlier, Patrick, that if you have two impositions, they may say, you have to say tomato, you have to say tomato, and the recipient can't resolve that conflict because the conflict lies in two different agents, which are not him or her. Whereas if the promise if we think in promises, someone can easily promise, I will say tomato to you and tomato to you. And that's not even a conflict. It's just a different context. So things that appear conflicting can be resolved by using promises rather than impositions. And this diagram, another version of that is imposing is like throwing someone a ball and hoping they'll catch it, but they may be unable or unwilling, simply saying, nope, not going to do it, or they might be asleep. Whereas a promise is the pre-announcement, the invitation, I am willing to catch a ball, and say, okay, I accept your willingness to catch a ball, and I will throw you the ball. And that's much more likely to succeed than trying to surprise someone with an imposition. So the kind of short version of that is that in a world without trust, promises are not worth too much, because if we don't trust someone to keep their promise, it's not helping. In a world without promises, trust is irrelevant for that reason. And Axelrod, the Cold War story, taught us a little bit about how that works. Trust needs a reason, and that reason will be over time whether or not we keep our promises, whether we have a track record which we can learn and feel confident in, leading to predictability through repetition. And that repetition or iteration or continuity of process is the thing that will lead to that. And that's the benefit of the promise.
Give an example. Let's say I'm managing the security program somehow in a company, and typically that would be a list of things to do, stuff to comply to the whole organization. I write up these rules. That's pretty much like imposing something on the organization. It's almost like management saying, make it secure, make it so. So how would you suggest they rephrase their messaging to others in that respect? Because in the example you gave, I can do this. Like, what can management do then, or like, how do they rephrase their messaging in that part?
Yeah, it's interesting. Should we try and sketch?
You trust the technology for this, Mark?
I trust the technology. I'm not sure I trust myself. All right. So I have this trusty tablet here.
Wow, this is next level, Mark.
Okay, we're going to try this. So you said, what happens if we have a manager? So a manager, of course, is an agent. We may want to give him some arms and legs. There's a very big head. Managers usually have very large heads. And we have some team members who are also agents. Might be several of them. And so the classical way of thinking is that the manager tries to impose a request with a giant fist, like here, make it so. And this may be ineffective because the agents in the team might not promise to accept that. They might not catch by promising to accept this imposition. Some of them might be so afraid of failing that they may simply take those orders. And this, of course, is how it works in the military. People voluntarily promise that they will accept orders from someone else. But another way of doing it would be for the manager to try to invite cooperation. So we have another team down here, and none of them are promising to listen too closely. But the manager could simply make a promise to invite them to a discussion, like a meeting or an open space. An open space is a great example because it has this rules of conduct where you go in whenever you feel like it. You're invited. You don't have to come if you don't want to. You walk away when you're finished, and it's a pretty loose arrangement. And the way to entice people to such a thing is to promise something a bit more concrete. So the invitation should probably include something like free cookies. So they're giving something away without an obligation on the part of the listeners. Now they're thinking, okay, hey, that's cool. I will accept your invitation to come and listen. And the manager then makes another promise, which is, you know what? If you guys were to give me the mandate for making this decision, I think this would be a really good outcome, and I could do this and I could do that, and I have these experiences. So it makes it a more specific promise, which is a bit like homing in on a target, right? So the invitation kind of starts out here somewhere, and he's trying to fire his promise into the bullseye of cooperation here. And they're thinking, well, you know, I don't want to go for the bullseye straight away because they may not accept it. But if I sneak in the back route, if I try to offer them cookies and then I tell them about my experience and try to get them to promise me the mandate, then what I can do in cooperation terms is each one of these people in the team will try to offer a mandate for the decision. And the manager can then accept that mandate and say, it is now my role to conditionally make a decision given the mandate that I've received from the team. And that's an authorized promise, right? The authorization has come from the recipient to play a role in the system, which wasn't assumed, it wasn't imposed, it was kind of invited as a cooperative act. And there's a lot of back and forth, going this way and you're back. And this back and forth between the two gets stronger over time, the more interactions there are. And this thick line, if you will, is your representation of trust. The thicker this becomes, the stronger it becomes, like strengthening your bones by exercise. This becomes a measure of the trust between the team and the manager to fulfill that particular role. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think it can even start earlier. It's just, okay, we're facing this problem. So manager could be neutrally stating, you know, the problem space, and then even ask the others, like, what are you able to do, right? And he can listen that, like, you know, I can do this, I can do that. And he gets all the promises, and then he can see whether we need somebody else there as well to promise. And I like the idea of open space, because in an open space, even though somebody started the conversation or the session, he's not the one dominating the whole discussion, and everybody's allowed to, you know, interact and like shift on the idea and work it. Work it like a relationship, I guess.
What I like about this picture is that these are roles, they're not people. So management is a role that could be taken on by any member of any team at any time. If they simply come up with the idea to invite others to give them the mandate to lead that particular initiative, then it could be someone within dev, someone within ops, and they could be different leaders for different issues. So it's not necessary to focus all of the responsibility or all of the decision-making for every issue with one person, which we call a traditional chieftain or leader, which we bow down to and so on. We can try to give the best person the job if the communication arrives at that decision through the process of trusted interaction.
Yeah, it's much more like enabling teams, you know, to take the decisions, or like put the decision in the place of in the hands of the people who are doing the work, because they're best viewing the things. This notion of not self-servicing, but, you know, making it making the decision where it needs to be by the people who are there. Yeah.
Exactly. So let's go back to our slides. I wanted to make this point because I think this is quite germane to why we tend to have a culture of imposition rather than of promising. And it goes to our construction as an organism in a way. We develop brains. Brains allow us to coordinate all the parts of our body quite quickly. Whenever you have centralized control, it can be quite fast, which is why we tend to centralize things. Decentralized organisms like slime molds and ant colonies can be very efficient on a small scale, but they tend not to move in a coherent way very quickly. So if you want to move coherently quickly, a brain is a good idea. A central controller is a good idea. And so the way we interact with the world is to command our hands and to interact and pull levers and push buttons. And we impose upon our surroundings in that way and hope that we can overwhelm them or secure cooperation. But that doesn't scale too well. So once you get beyond a certain ability to overwhelm or overpower our surroundings, we find that we need to ask nicely for cooperation. So we end up with a society with a rather different model of command and control, which is we try to ask people's willingness to cooperate in the way that we just described with the management sketch. We ask for a mandate to govern, and then perhaps we appoint certain leaders for certain roles, and that helps us to move more coherently and more quickly. But ultimately, a lot of the time we spend our time as individual cells working completely independently on different projects, perhaps coming together to sell each other something or exchange something on a one-to-one basis, like little microservices. But when we need to move together, we need that more coherent point of action or kind of action. So the scale will also play a role in this. I think a nice example of this that I thought about was a pull request when we're collaborating around programming. In the world of open source, for example, we have a lot of people working on bits of code in parallel, quite uncoordinated, but for them to come together into a single branch of code, a coordinated, coherent bit of software, hopefully, these things need to be integrated by a single party, a single agent, and that's the purpose of a pull request. We offer people a mandate to contribute. They say, okay, we were willing to take you on the project. That's a mandate. They can come back, create their input, and then instead of there being one manager, there are now many managers making decisions, but there's a meta manager saying, okay, I will accept your request conditionally that it makes sense to me and that I can integrate it into this greater whole. So you see, this interaction through version control is a very interesting twist on this idea of manager, leadership, and followers or workers, management and workers. The relationship goes both ways as a kind of symbiosis.
But so I've seen it used for good in a way that the pull request is a review, somebody sees it as an invitation. Do you want to merge this and look at it? It's also sometimes used as like, I don't trust the other. Like nobody can commit immediately to master because we don't trust everybody, and there always has to be a second person to do the review. So isn't that coming back on a control to verify things?
Excellent point. I think the misunderstanding there is that if you ask for a bunch of people that you don't know that they're 100% aligned, perhaps you haven't asked them specifically in advance to promise their competence, their alignment with the final outcome, what the goal is, what we're seeking for. But you say, oh, send us a bunch of stuff. That's a little bit impositional in itself. So you want to be a bit cautious about what you're willing to accept. because if you don't have that alignment up front, you need to secure that alignment when you do the integration. And I think that's the point, that if you haven't initially secured those promises by sufficient interaction up front, then you need to verify to some extent what is being promised. And that's a sign of the relationship not being long enough, or we don't know each other like friends or colleagues enough yet to do that. So you may want to erect some of these boundaries, these access permissions that we were talking about earlier, to limit that.
So it's almost saying like, if I'm confident enough, I can do the merge and the pull myself on the system. And then if not confident enough, I will ask somebody to do the review. Because if a review has to be done every time, there's a cost of delay. I see in lots of companies that just takes time, where it might be the trivial thing as change a name, which doesn't make sense. I've seen many companies like have a little bit like it needs to be like other team lead, almost like mandatory. But then they have also the policy, if nobody responds within the day, something else will happen depending on their policy.
I like this point. Let me draw a little bit again. Go back to a sketch. So we've now got a bunch of contributors who promise something. See what it is they promise. They promise code. And we have an integrator.
Which is again a role. Everybody can be the integrator.
Which is a role, right? Yeah. And the integrator may be using Git or some other tool, but that tool is basically part of them. So that's something that they promise to integrate. Now we need to ask, what does this integrator actually promise the world? So what are they going to promise to, say, say the world? And the world is a little, here we go, there's the world. Suppose they promise something general like stuff. That's an easy promise to make. Now they don't have to be too careful about what they accept from anybody to integrate. So these guys might be super confident that they know exactly what's the right thing for this software to promise. Stuff can be anything. And so they can send their code and it will be accepted immediately by default. No worries, don't need to check it. But what if stuff is not good enough? We want very specific outcome. If these guys haven't promised to keep to that very specific outcome, they may sabotage the purpose of this integration point by submitting something which is bad, right? So they may break this promise by their contribution if the integrator accepts their offer over here willy-nilly without too much care. On the other hand, if they're very, very careful, they may prevent this promise from being broken, this very specific outcome from being broken. So we need to be a bit aware of, are we willing to break promises a little bit in order to be more open in our policy of acceptance, and then perhaps repair it. So we may have another promise here, which is to repair if broken.
That's almost like the Annan cord, right? If there's something failure, the whole system, somebody pulls the Annan cord and everybody tries to fix it.
Exactly, yeah. So then we then might make this one conditional on not being broken, not broken. So we can make this promise as long as the thing isn't broken, but if it's broken, then we may promise to repair it very quickly. And as many people have pointed out in the past, there are different ways to recover from a broken promise. One is to try to revert. One is to repair very quickly. One is to shut down and let the client pick a different provider.
That's an interesting business perspective. Yeah, go somewhere else. We failed.
Well, this is kind of the basis of A/B testing as well, right? So you may shut down one set of servers and allow the user to reconnect, and then they will get the other one. So there are different ways we do. Or right now, you might be denied entry to your local doctor's surgery. Sorry, we can't take you. Go somewhere else. Whatever the reason. But as long as you can keep your ultimate promise, this one, as long as this promise to the client can somehow be kept somehow, then you can still fulfill your ultimate purpose, your ultimate outcome. And then the role of these guys contributing becomes a part of a much larger process. And the question we're asking is really, how dependent are we upon these? How fragile is the system to the changes made here? Do we allow a certain fragility because we've made a robust process of repair down here? Or do we break the whole thing suddenly because we don't have a good response? So it's a little bit about the ability of this agent to respond when they find that it's unable to keep its promise, this promise, and has it even defined that promise very carefully? If you haven't made a very clear commitment to the customer, perhaps the customer may end up being upset, but you don't understand why, because I never promised that in the first place. But if you've made a clear commitment, customer's upset, you either need to repair it really quickly before they can discover the problem, or you may need to, redress the issue somehow. So I think it goes to the overall fragility of the system, whether we're willing to accept changes ad hoc when we don't trust necessarily, and by trust I mean have deep knowledge of the behavior of these people contributing, or whether or not we have to go to enormous lengths to verify and prevent bad stuff from happening.
Yeah, what's interesting is that when you say stuff is a generic thing, when you say make the system secure, that's a generic thing. But it's not very specific. But if you would say you pass all the tests in the build pipeline, that is a very specific outcome that you can measure. So
passing all the tests, of course, is a very specific outcome. It's very clearly defined, but it might be wholly inadequate for keeping this promise here, because this promise might, in fact, none of the tests might actually cover this promise being kept. That's a totally different set of promises, right? We promise that our tests actually completely and totally determine the outcome of the promise to the customer. I wonder how many people can promise that.
Yeah, that's true. All right.
So I think this is kind of important because it reveals how the specific promises a process makes may actually not support the things you believe that it supports. We may trust ourselves to keep a promise which we actually haven't promised that we're going to keep internally, right? We wrote a bunch of tests, so we think we're doing well. And of course we trust ourselves. Yeah, of course the software will be fine. But we haven't proven that those were the right tests for every possible incident that might cause something bad to happen. Yeah. We had an interesting case of this. My colleague in Amsterdam, Jan Baxter, that co-wrote the Promise Theory book with me, we did an analysis of the Boeing 737 MAX scenario and the whole debacle around the sensors on the tilt sensors for the anti-stall system, and whether or not, in fact, the software was an anti-stall system. Did it promise that, or did it not promise that? And actually, the manufacturer couldn't all the time claim that it wasn't an anti-stall system, and then later kind of tried to claim that it was, or that it wasn't, or that this or that, and they could never make up their mind whether it was or it wasn't. So it boiled down to the fact that the system they had put together was not clearly defined. It didn't make a clear, coordinated, coherent promise. It didn't have a brain that was powerful enough, if you will, to coordinate the whole system. And that's kind of the dilemma we have when a system becomes quite distributed and has many parts. Does it still, behave as an entity? Can we still draw a box around it like this, or a ring around it like this, and say, this behaves as a single entity?
Yeah, and then of course we can try to keep that inside the box, but then there's many things going on outside the box that will influence us. Like on the previous diagram you showed, with the head or the body versus the system, that I think part of DevOps is based on the system theory. We do something here that looks nice, and we try to make it so in our world, and then somewhere else that has an influence, and that might negatively or positively influence us again. So,
and again, that goes back to this unable or unwilling to comply. We may refuse a change because we don't think it's the right one, or we may not be able to take on the change fast enough because we're busy, or the change might be, we might be unable to read the change because it's written in a foreign language. There are many, many ways a system can break down.
Right.
So coming back to this example, the pull request, I think there are a lot of ways in which that model is illustrative of the problem of cooperation, and formalizes it in quite an interesting way, with different branches, different agents, each operating independently. But in order to be coherent and act as an entity, we need this process of coordinating or calibrating them according to a common promise, which is going to be representative of the whole organization. And that brings us to this, the original issue of Dev and Ops, which I think is this kind of throw it over the wall issue of imposing upon another team, Dev being in the driving seat and saying, we know that this is best for you to have a new version. And by the way, this happens to me from time to time now with Apple and Android. They stopped asking if we want updates. They kind of just push them and say, you need to reboot now to take it, like it or not. And this can break things. It can cause all kinds of problems downstream. But as I recall, and you can correct me on this, one of the original issues with Dev and Ops was this annoyance of operations folks, the sysadmins, to having software thrown at them that they knew nothing about, and they were then expected to kind of run it and maintain it.
Yeah, and I think Ops thought that Dev wasn't keeping their promises to write good software, and Devs thought of Ops of not keeping their promise of putting things in production and making it reliable. So yeah, this I think after 10 years it shifted quite a bit.
Really? I hope
well,
so.
maybe not in reality, at least in our minds, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We're now aware of our dysfunction more. But so ultimately, this is a trust issue, right? So we thought of it as being a one-way flow from Dev to Ops. And this, I think, is a mistake that people make in business modeling all of the time. We assume a flow model, a flow diagram. We go from this to that, and that's the direction in which causation moves through the system. Dev make a change that causes a change at Ops, that causes the users to get an update. But in actual fact, it requires the cooperation of both parties. And over time, that ongoing relationship is what builds trust between the two. And that trust, in turn, is the thing that may or may not allow them to trust each other to do their jobs in the future, and may make them defensive, irritable, angry, bad-mannered, and so on.
Yeah, it's like the pressure of doing multiple deploys a day has caused this multiple interactions of people discussing the problems in a way that the trust relation has been strengthened because there's been so many small interactions going in as well. I found it, but that's probably another subject. I found it interesting that once the relationship is kind of mature, there's a lot less of interaction. But maybe the other interesting part is that dev and ops in this model are considered different groups, and they should be considered roles. And that's what a lot of the teams are doing. They're doing dev and ops at the same time because that's something that makes it easier to do that.
Yeah, that's a great point, that these are roles and not agents, even though in the old way of thinking, you would hire developers and you would hire ops people. These days, we're talking about full stack engineers, people who can take the system through the whole life cycle for a smaller part of it. That was part of the origin of microservices and the microservice concept. But the same individuals may play the role of developer and operations to better foster that trust, because if you don't trust yourself to do the job, who are you going to trust?
But we need security right now. Where does it fit in, Mark?
Right. So this is the very next point, right? So where is security in this picture? And I think this is something that everyone listening should spend a few minutes to think about. Is security a role in this picture? Is it an agent in this picture? Again, our cultural tendency is to try to hire someone to fix security. That was you, right?
Yeah, perfect.
It's him. You hire someone to fix the security, but does that person then end up promising something? What do they promise? Are they offering something to dev and to ops, or are they imposing on dev and ops, or are they trying to seek the collaboration of dev and ops, or are they a totally independent thing? Like a trusted third party, like you go to these certificate registration authorities. Is that security? Is that the agent of security, that your security, your HTTP certificate? Where exactly is security in this picture? So we come to a bit of a conundrum, which is a role in, as we understand it in promise theory, is a pattern of promises that these agents are making to one another. And we've seen invitation, imposition, acceptance, non-acceptance, conditional promises. I can deliver this goal if you deliver the goods, and so on. But these different roles make individual promises germane to what they control. Remember, an agent can only promise its own behavior, not the behavior of its neighbors. Dev can't promise on behalf of ops, ops can't promise on behalf of dev, and sec, who even are they? So dev makes certain promises to write code, to integrate tests, to do this and that. We can decide what are those promises, and to our listeners, what do you think the promises of dev are and the promises of ops are? But then we come to sec. Who are these guys? Who are they promising? What are they promising on behalf of? Is it like the management thing where they kind of have to seek a mandate to contribute? In which case, do we let them into the story of what we're delivering or not? Do they become dependent on others, or can they do something independently themselves? This is the question, I think, which makes this concept of DevSecOps not quite on a par with DevOps, because Dev and Ops, they have their realms, they're fairly well described, they know how to deal with it, they need to cooperate. But Sec is not really like Dev and Ops in the same way, because it doesn't have a thing which is theirs in the same way, perhaps. Or am I getting it wrong?
Yeah, well, it made me think of Dev, Ops, and Sec as almost like competences, like somebody who knows about security, who knows about running something, who knows about development. And when I talk to security folks, they always say like, well, we want to have the developer be more aware of all the different threats, all the different things that we're doing. We want to get the visibility from the ops persons to see what's happening in real time, whether we should react or that. But what is like, same in Dev and Ops, oh, we want to know how to run the software. So that's the operational skill. And then the dev is like, oh, we want to like add a new feature. So I think a lot of the silos or the roles have been built around the competence or a skill in the past.
So my conundrum, as I presented here, is what I assert. Let's make this as a hypothesis then. The DevOps can work independently on something, but Sec maybe can't do anything without the cooperation of others, even though it has this special competence that you mentioned. So there needs to be an issue of authorization somehow to enable the security folks or whoever is in that role, to enable that role to play a role, for that role to be accepted. They may be offering something, but will we accept what it's offering? Is there a security team? Well, sometimes there might be, but exactly where do they live and what is it they command? What resource is it that they control? I'm pretty sure it's not authorization, or it's not access rights to stuff on the system. It's usually the operations folks that do that. Is it access to the security certificates? Is it, what exactly is it that SEC can do? I think this is a discussion that I would love our audience to participate in.
Yeah, it's sometimes I think it's about, if you look at the whole company and the system, that everybody comes in and has a pressure point. So they kind of, you can't think about all the things all the time. And like, you need to have some people thinking about security, operational, and so on. And then when the pressure points for security would be like, we set a policy, or we need to be aware of these attacks, or, you know, is a code vulnerable, or even what's our GDPR policy, privacy policy, you know, they kind of tend to focus on these kind of subjects, and they put the pressure on the system by doing that. Yeah, but it feels a little bit more like management. That's true.
In a way, I feel our education system has failed us in this. Having been a university lecturer myself and taught all of these subjects, actually, DevSecOps, different occasions, I see how we don't teach developers security very well. We don't teach them operations very well. We almost don't teach people security or operations at all. Most computer science education is based on development of software. And the issues of security and operations are learned in the field by bitter experience, perhaps by a trusted mentor over time. But that means that we need to impose a role to tell someone who, with that experience, may need to come in and teach people in an organization how to deal with, or how to think about coding for operations or coding for security. And that's maybe not, maybe that's part of where the difficulty lies in organizations today, that you have to kind of impose a role on a company to have security.
Yeah, but it almost feels like this is, when you have children, you kind of impose some of the roles so they can experience things and learn things, but it's more like enabling by imposition. I don't know how to say that better.
I think I understand what you're saying. So sometimes sometimes it's useful to impose. We shouldn't think that imposing is always bad, because sometimes we need it. Like when we have when we get notifications on our phone, that's a good kind of imposition, right? We've promised to take that because it's actually useful to us. But when it comes to something like, which is more deeply connected to people's sense of dignity, their own role, their own sense of self-worth in an organization, imposing upon them feels uncomfortable. And that's where a lot of the discomforts over DevOps and Sec, I think, arises. And if we impose a role, say you need to know this, even though you don't know you need to know it, if we don't build that up by having a trusted interaction, by invitation, mandate, layer upon layer of kind of coming towards one another and being humble, and you come with your humble offering to the gods, and you gradually creep forwards, and you end up in a relationship where you can talk to each other as equals. If you don't do that, but you just come in with all guns firing and say, you got to do this, you got to do that, then it goes straight to people's sense of dignity, and they will react negatively.
For sure.
All right, let's break our session there and for some more details and promises.